The floorboards in our house on Marrow Street used to speak to me, or at least that is what I told myself during the long, quiet years of my marriage to Clara. In the beginning, those creaks and groans were the sounds of a life being built, the rhythmic backdrop to a partnership I believed was forged in the hottest fires of shared experience. Now, as I stand in the empty living room of what was once our sanctuary in the coastal town of Oakhaven, the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight against my chest. I look at the pale rectangles on the walls where photos of us used to hang, and I realize that the story I told myself for a decade was a beautiful, elaborate fiction. The breaking point didn't happen with a shout or a slammed door. It happened with a whisper that I was never meant to hear. A few words that dismantled the foundation of my entire existence. It was the moment I realized that, while I had been building a cathedral of love, Clara had merely been seeking a storm cellar. Our story didn't start with a spark, but with a shadow. 5 years before we stood at an altar, we were both standing at a graveside. Julian had been my best friend since primary school and Clara's closest confidant throughout university. When his car hydroplaned off the Oakhaven Bridge on a rain-slicked Tuesday in November, the world simply stopped turning for both of us. At the funeral, the air smelled of damp wool and lilies, a cloying scent that still makes my stomach turn. I remember seeing Clara across the aisle, her face a mask of porcelain grief, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't hold her prayer book. I reached out and took her hand, and in that moment, our fates were sealed. We became each other's life rafts in a sea of overwhelming sorrow. We spent the following months huddled together in coffee shops and on park benches, speaking in the shorthand of the bereaved, anchored by the only person who understood the magnitude of what we had lost. As the months turned into years, the raw edges of grief began to dull, but our proximity only increased. I mistook her reliance on me for a deep, burgeoning romantic devotion. I was the one who checked her car's oil, the one who brought her soup when she was ill, and the one who held her through the nightmares that Julian's death had left behind. I felt a profound sense of purpose in being her protector. I thought I was winning her heart, inch by hard-earned inch. What I failed to see was that Clara wasn't falling in love. She was falling into safety. I represented a world where nothing could hurt her again, a predictable and sturdy environment where the chaos of loss could be kept at bay. To her, I was a bank account of emotional and financial security, a steady hand in a world she no longer trusted. I mistook her gratitude for passion, her presence for partnership, and her compliance for commitment. The proposal happened on the Oakhaven Pier, under a sky the color of a bruised plum. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet question asked with a heart full of hope. I told her I wanted to take care of her for the rest of our lives. She looked at me with an expression I now recognize as profound relief, though at the time, I chose to call it joy. She said yes, and we were married 6 months later in a small ceremony that felt more like a closing of a chapter than the beginning of a new one. Our wedding day was pleasant, filled with the soft approval of friends who thought it was only right that we ended up together. We bought the house on Marrow Street, painted the kitchen a warm butter yellow, and settled into the comfortable rhythms of a domestic life that looked, from the outside, like a picture-perfect success. However, as the years stretched on, the emotional connection began to erode in ways that were almost invisible to the naked eye. The intimacy between us became a polite routine, a series of gestures performed out of habit rather than desire. I would try to initiate deep conversations about our future or our dreams, but Clara would always gently steer the topic back to the mundane, the garden, the bills, the upcoming neighborhood gathering. There was a glass wall between us that I couldn't see but could constantly feel. I told myself that this was just what long-term love looked like, that the fire eventually gave way to the embers of companionship. I convinced myself that her distance was just a remnant of her old trauma, a protective shell she still hadn't fully shed. I tried harder, bought more gifts, planned more trips, and worked longer hours to ensure she never had to worry about a single thing. I was a man building a fortress for a woman who was already looking for the exit. The revelation came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that started as unremarkable as any other. I had come home early from the office to surprise Clara with flowers for our 9th anniversary. I entered through the garage, my footsteps muffled by my work shoes. I heard her voice coming from the sunroom. She was on the phone with her sister, Lydia. I paused, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like an intense conversation. Then I heard my name, and the world slowed down. "I know he's a good man, Lydia," Clara said, her voice sounding weary in a way I had never heard before. "Elias is the best man I've ever known, but I don't love him. I never did, not like that. After Julian died, the world felt like it was ending, and Elias was the only thing that felt solid. I married him because I was terrified of being alone and broken. He was my safety net, but now the net feels like a cage. I've spent 10 years pretending to feel a spark that just isn't there because I was too afraid to be insecure again." I stood in the hallway, the bouquet of roses feeling like lead in my hands. The betrayal wasn't about another man, it was about the fundamental lie of our union. Every kiss, every "I love you," every shared meal had been a transaction for her, a payment for the security I provided. I didn't confront her right then. I walked back out to the garage, sat in my car, and watched the sunset over the Oak Haven Hills. The pain was different than the grief I had felt for Julian. This was a cold, hollow realization that the last decade of my life had been an accidental performance. I realized that by providing her with everything she needed to feel safe, I had inadvertently robbed us both of the chance to find a love that was actually real. I wasn't her partner. I was her insurance policy. The decision to leave was the hardest thing I have ever done, yet it was the only honest action left to me. When I finally sat her down and told her what I had heard, she didn't even try to deny it. She just wept, not with the jagged sobs of a broken heart, but with the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had been caught in a long-term deception. We talked for hours, peeling back the layers of our history until the bare, uncomfortable truth was all that remained. She admitted that she had tried to love me, that she had hoped the feeling would grow over time, but that gratitude is a poor substitute for passion. I realized then that staying would be an insult to both of us. I deserved to be loved for who I was, not for what I could provide, and she deserved to live a life that wasn't a constant performance of affection. Finalizing the divorce was a clinical, heartbreaking process. In Oak Haven, everyone knows everyone's business, and the whispers in the grocery store were hard to ignore. We divided the assets with a grim efficiency. The butter yellow kitchen was sold along with the house on Marrow Street. The lawyers spoke in terms of percentages and equity, never mentioning the thousands of hours I had spent trying to make her smile. As I signed the final papers, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The weight of trying to maintain a one-sided romance was finally gone. I moved into a small apartment overlooking the harbor, a place that was mine alone. I had to learn how to be Elias again, not just Clara's husband or the man who took care of things. Now, as I sit on my new balcony watching the fishing boats return to the Oak Haven harbor, I am finally finding peace. The anger has faded, replaced by a profound understanding of human fragility. Clara and I don't speak often, but when we do, there is a hard-won honesty between us that was never there during our marriage. I have started hiking again, a hobby I gave up years ago because Clara didn't enjoy it. I am rediscovering the things that make me feel alive, independent of anyone else's needs. I have learned that shared grief can be a powerful bond, but it is not a foundation for a lifetime. True stability doesn't come from another person. It comes from the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, even when the world is shaking. I lost a decade to a beautiful lie, but I gained the truth. And in the end, that is the only thing worth holding on to. I am moving on, not with a shadow behind me, but with the clear, bright light of the future ahead.